morning, for Together Time, we read the story Enemy Pie. The book complements today's topic on war because it shows the true nature of how misunderstandings and miscommunication can lead to the creation of enemies. It also relates to us as UUs, who value listening to those we do not think we agree with, and who aspire to learn to find deeper truth and meaning, trying to understand others even when their truth does not align with ours. Jeremy Ross has inherent worth and dignity, but when an immediate assumption was made by the protagonist of Enemy Pie, commonalities they shared were forgotten, and this is how enemies are created. I want to highlight that when we read a children's story with a moral, we're explaining something complex in a manner that children will understand and can use in their lives. Let's take a look at my generation. I'm 18, I'm the Gen Z population. We are sometimes seen as immature and lacking in empathy. We communicate a lot through jokes, and we're sometimes seen as unambitious. But the only reason I bring this up is because in January, a stream of photos and short videos called memes, which are often funny, were spread around the internet. These appeared after the US drone assassinated an Iranian Major General, Qasem Soleimani. The threat of World War III became a reality for us. When these memes came out, they were indeed sometimes funny, but most people watching them were uneasy about them or even sickened. Questions appeared like, how can you joke about such a serious topic? War is not a game. As Gary said, during the Vietnam War, many people my age were drafted. Although we may not be able to compare ourselves with them, my generation has nonetheless been dealing with violence our whole lives. What is actually being conveyed through these photos and videos is a huge amount of fear. None of us want to be drafted. So when the threat of World War III came in January, we panicked. In the words of Herbert Hoover, older men declare war, but it is the youth that must fight and die. I have personally not seen war, and yet I've always felt that I've been in one. From the stories of heroes who fought in the wars of the 20th century, to the unlimited footage on media platforms, to the glorification of war through movies and video games, I feel like I have seen violence. And I'm not saying that we should eliminate these forms of media, nor am I saying that it is the cause of war, but it has affected how my generation copes with it. When filled with fear, we cope through humor. We deal with dark things by trying to see the light in them. Within the last month, our world has seen how social war can impact not only one nation, but all nations. With the use of technology, there is a change in how progression can be made. Movements can begin online. Although there are flaws to the endless accumulation of knowledge and fake news that our devices provide, the benefits include not needing to physically fight in wars. There have been so many movements in the last decade. Most of them have been successful without actually having to go to war. Through marches and peaceful protests, movements like LGBTQ+ rights, Me Too movement, and currently the Black Lives Matter movement have been fought without war. This proves that disagreements can be solved and progress made through means other than violence. In fact, these methods can be more effective. As we discovered through recent rioting, violence is not beneficial. While some may feel that it is justified, in reality, it covers up the peaceful efforts being made and often leads to more violence. The reason I chose this topic today is that in May I took a course on World War abolition and creating new systems of maintaining peace. I was by far the youngest and least experienced, but I learned to question my beliefs and views on not only war and the way that the world works, but I was challenged to question how my school dealt with these ideas and how my UU values play a part into my views about war. Some people believe violence is the only solution, and my hope is that when seeing these peaceful acts of protest, they realize that fighting is not the only option. War is impractical. It is expensive, and from what I have learned, the pattern of war continues over and over again. Allies become enemies, war breaks out, new alliances are formed, which eventually will break, and we experience the onset of war all over again. World War I was supposedly the war to end all wars, but using a quote Plato said, "Only the dead have seen the end of war," because not long after World War II broke out, alliances were broken and countries ended up enemies again. But after World War II, the United Nations was formed to try and maintain these new alliances. Now, this cycle may not seem too disastrous, a few years of war in exchange for 50 years of peace, but war is not that simple. War is humanity's deadliest activity. From 500 BC to 2000 AD, history records about 1,000 major wars. But in the 20th century alone, an estimated 165 wars killed as many as 258 million people. While searching for World War III memes, I was targeted with numerous ads promoting the US Air Force. They were glorifying women flying in jets heroically across the sky. I could talk about the fact that they're using feminism and the movement for gender equality to promote war and make it attractive, but that's a different topic for a different day. Instead, I'm going to focus on the war portion. Instead of showing the true horror of war or even any violence in those ads, it glorifies it. As though war is just flying a plane across the sky and looking for terrorists. This is not the case. Soldiers are left with lasting effects such as post-traumatic stress disorder and physical disabilities that affect not only them, but their loved ones. In 2018, a statistic showed that 20 veterans commit suicide every day. My grandfather lived in Indonesia as a child, and when World War II broke out and the Japanese invaded, he was interned in a Japanese war camp. He stayed there the whole war and was eventually rescued by members of Shell, the oil company. As an adult, he devoted his life to working for Shell. My grandmother lived in Nazi-occupied Holland, dealing with food shortages and the threat of being taken by German soldiers. She watched her mother, my great-grandmother, turn into skin and bones trying to feed 5 children. After the war, decades later, my mother and her 3 brothers were born. But the trauma from the war was far from over. PTSD played a gigantic role in their life. Through my mother's parents, and even through the generations, I have been affected. War trauma doesn't just disappear. The Air Force ad also did not highlight that terrorists and enemy are not the only ones being killed. In fact, the effect on civilians is catastrophic. The economy struggles, people lose their jobs, houses, schools, loved ones, and most significantly, civilian casualties make up the majority of deaths in war. Not only during active war are people being killed who have nothing to do with the conflict, but after war, weapons and explosives continue to kill civilians. An issue you may have heard about is around 15 years ago. It's the movement against the Cluster Munition Coalition. Civil society groups campaigned against the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of cluster bombs. Cluster bombs are explosive weapons left behind after the war that will suddenly go off and kill many. The bombs will be scattered during the conflict and either are not triggered or they will not explode upon the original impact. These weapons would take many non-combatant lives during the conflict, which is already inherently wrong, but it also takes many lives after. Unfortunately, children become regular victims, as their curiosity to pick up the shiny object on the ground ultimately ends their lives. Children have the right to be curious. They should not have to fear that what they find will kill them. NATO created a treaty to outlaw these weapons. All countries signed except for Russia, China, and the United States. The Air Force ad also fails to mention that it is not only human lives which are impacted. Our ecosystems are too. Many animals are displaced from their natural environments and killed in the action. Furthermore, our planet is drenched in chemicals and rubble left behind by the war. War is never as simplistic as the act of fighting. It changes entire ways of life and impacts people for their entire lives and generations to come. Violence, I find, is a battle of egos. Who has the bigger guns? Who destroys who first? For example, the Cold War. Ultimately, it was a peaceful agreement which averted total global destruction. Violence only leads to deaths, usually civilians, and often focused on those who have been historically marginalized. Our UU values center around working toward a just and equal world, which is exactly what humanity needs to be working on. Peace is difficult to achieve. What we need is for lots of people who are able and educated to step up and voice their opinions, to actively support peaceful resolutions. It is up to those who have a voice and have power to step up. Whether that is in person or over social media, more people make a larger difference. People who lack information about peaceful efforts and the power that they have rationalize that war looks faster, more effective way of resolving conflict. Peaceful forms of resolution may be difficult to create initially, but they are longer lasting. However, it is difficult to educate generations that have become accustomed to a certain way of resolving differences. As I was going through this course, I discovered the violence has actually achieved very little in the long term. It has shifted the economy like with the Great Depression, but it has actually been the non-violent organizations and systems that have built structures for long-term peace. We can create these structures on all levels of society. As individuals, we must vote. Vote for more diverse leadership. Diversity is key in solving misunderstandings and making sure we represent more of the population. But we can also become actively involved. Join and volunteer in civil society groups. These are the groups that avoid war. They work towards the non-violent resolutions we need. They are set up in locations that are familiar with the direct issue and what the needs of those in trouble. As a nation, we can change our education system to teach peace and not war. We could reform much of the education system if we spent less on war. Education needs to focus on the peaceful efforts being made by people like Martin Luther King Jr., who led 5,000 people in a march against the Vietnam War, or other relatable examples like the 9,000 students who marched in 1969, which demonstrate that young people have power too. We could begin enforcing change with what we teach in history lessons and be mindful of how we raise our children so we can engage in long-term and impactful change. It is important to teach youth that violence is not the only answer. Parents teach children to use their words, but somewhere along the way, that lesson was forgotten. Many have learned that displays of empathy and love are weakness, and winning by force earns respect. In the words of Margaret Atwood, war is what happens when language fails. Communication is key in all parts of our daily lives and can be used just as crucially to avoid war. Critical thinking is a focus in schools, and that brings me hope. It is a useful skill that could easily avoid violence. Violence is for those who see no other alternative and usually do not want to change their perception. Peace is attainable for anyone who takes the time to educate themselves about war and alternative solutions. It can be achieved by having empathy, compassion, understanding, and most importantly, the ability to listen. The values we are taught through childhood, we just need to take them into our adulthood. On a national level, we could work on disarmament. The reason most countries do not want to abolish war is that it is profitable for them. War is seen not only as a solution to the conflicts, but as a profitable system. The USA is the largest arms buyer and seller. Opposing US weapons sales to Saudi Arabia or weaponry gifts to other countries does not require confrontation with US patriotism. Instead, we can confront the arms trade as the global health threat that it is. Every year, the international trade of death-dealing weapons is worth nearly $200 billion. We can focus on smaller steps, such as ridding ourselves of drone involvement in war, which currently have very few regulations. We can also remove other extremely harmful weapons, such as chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. Some people may feel that we expose ourselves to the threat of terrorists, but in fact, most wars that are fought have American weapons on both sides of the conflict. By stopping the production of these weapons globally, there is little threat. The focus is also on building up other systems to make up for the tearing down of violence. Defunding the military can aid other causes. For example, the USA spends $1.5 trillion to build and maintain one F-35 jet, and the USA has a total of 520 of these jets. If we gave up one or two, that $3 trillion could go towards education, homelessness, green energy plans, anywhere back into the community. On a global scale, it would be beneficial to recreate the UN. The course had a focus on the failure of the UN to be able to step in. If we look at the numbers, in 2019, the UN budget was just under $3 billion. That is a rather small number to aid and keep together 193 countries. By contrast, the United States spent over $700 billion on their military alone. The budget constitutes more than 1/3 of all global military spending, and 3 times that of its number 2 global military power, China. The course and many other academics note that the UN was useful in theory, but practically it has rendered itself rather useless. A new global peace system needs to be created. The UN has a veto rule, which needs to either be reformed or just eliminated. Create a fair system where one superpower cannot prevent all countries from progressing due to their own selfish needs. We need to set up a system with a fair democracy, with a majority vote of all members, or at least the long-term members. Currently, it is still set under the system of the 5 powers each having a veto. They often use that to their own benefit, and there are 10 other temporary countries that get a vote. This is a mere 15 out of 193 countries which are being represented. This would equate to only 3 American states being represented out of 50. War abolition is a long process. We can remember that being patriotic is not an issue. Wanting to protect your country with systems of defense is also not the problem. The problem is the misuse of weaponry, and that it becomes about the abuse of power, which causes so much more violence than peace. In the words of Albert Dietrich, there are perhaps many causes worth dying for, but to me, certainly, there are none worth killing for. Thank you. Namaste.